Actors should be seen, not heard, especially when it comes to politics. That was the unspoken rule in Golden Age Hollywood, but some stars refused to play along, risking everything behind the scenes. What if the era's most beloved faces were also the voices challenging injustice when the cameras stopped rolling? As we peel back the curtain, you'll discover which legends quietly used their fame for far more than applause, and why some secrets, once revealed, changed the way you'll see Hollywood forever. First, Katherine Hepburn. Beneath the crisp diction and androgynous style that made Katherine Hepburn an icon, there was always a quiet current of rebellion running just beneath the surface. Hepburn arrived in Hollywood in 1932 with no patience for the trappings of celebrity. She wore pants when most women dared not, shunned publicity, and treated her contract like a legal chessboard. What most never saw was radicalism shaping her from the inside out. Raised by a suffragette mother and a progressive doctor father, Katherine grew up attending marches, meeting the likes of Margaret Sanger, and absorbing the conviction that women's rights were not just possible, they were inevitable. It was this foundation that turned her into an off-screen activist long before it was fashionable. In an era when a studio could destroy a career for a hint of subversive thinking, Hepburn's politics were an open secret. She campaigned for liberal candidates, used her influence to pressure censors toward more progressive stories, and spoke out about reproductive rights and birth control, echoing her mother's advocacy for Planned Parenthood. She even bought scripts and negotiated casting choices herself, defying the gendered power structures of studio Hollywood. While she wasn't a protest march regular like later activist stars, she lent her name to causes that would have blackballed lesser actors. On screen, Hepburn's persona reflected her private convictions. The fiercely independent women she played, journalists, aviators, and editors, blurred the line between performance and activism, making political statements just by existing. Off-screen, her business savvy and refusal to marry or have children became statements of autonomy in a culture built to shame such choices. By the late 1940s, her speech for Henry Wallace's Progressive Party cost her roles and threatened her public standing, but Hepburn never softened her principles for the sake of career comfort. In the end, Hepburn's greatest act of activism may have been simply living as herself, defiant, unapologetic, and determined to show other women that dignity and freedom were not privileges to be requested, but rights to be seized. Second, Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was a giant in every sense, a star on the stage and screen, an operatic baritone whose voice could fill concert halls and stadiums, and an athlete who broke color barriers before most Americans had ever heard the term civil rights. But it was his unwavering activism, conducted in the shadows and sometimes under government surveillance, that defined the true measure of his courage. At the height of his fame in the 1930s and 40s, Robeson was one of the few black stars who could demand a seat at any table, and he used that privilege to fight relentlessly against racial injustice, colonialism, and fascism, both in the United States and abroad. Robeson's activism wasn't merely symbolic. He spoke out for labor rights, denounced lynching and segregation in the American South, and campaigned for anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia. He publicly criticized the U.S. government's treatment of black citizens, famously declaring, "The artist must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. I have made my choice." Such words were radioactive in Cold War Hollywood, and the consequences were swift. The State Department revoked his passport. His concerts were canceled, his name was scrubbed from credits, and studios labeled him dangerous. Even friends and former colleagues distanced themselves, afraid that a show of solidarity could end their own careers. Yet Robeson did not shrink. He performed wherever he could, sometimes singing to crowds gathered on the Canadian border, his voice carrying across international lines. He corresponded with Albert Einstein, debated members of Congress, and never apologized for his politics, insisting that art and activism could never be separated. To Hollywood, he became a ghost, unhireable, unmentionable, but impossible to forget. Only in later decades would Robeson's artistic and political legacy begin to be reclaimed, his story a sobering lesson about the costs of courage and the limits of American tolerance for dissent. His voice, silenced by blacklist and bureaucracy, still echoes through every movement for justice that followed. Third, Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo's name was once synonymous with Hollywood success, a screenwriter whose words fueled blockbusters and Oscar winners, all while quietly slipping radical ideas into the most unlikely places. But beneath the polished surface of his career was a man whose political convictions defined and ultimately endangered his life in film. In the 1940s, Trumbo was one of the highest-paid writers in the industry, famed for his quick wit, biting dialogue, and gift for subversive storytelling. Off-screen, he was a vocal defender of labor unions, a supporter of civil liberties, and a proud member of the Communist Party at a time when such allegiances could ruin you. Trumbo's activism went far beyond rhetoric. He wrote for leftist journals, participated in labor actions, and used his Hollywood connections to shield colleagues from exploitation. The reckoning came in 1947, when he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee as part of the notorious Hollywood 10. Refusing to betray his friends or recant his beliefs, Trumbo was sentenced to jail for contempt of Congress and blacklisted from every major studio in town. Yet in exile, his activism only deepened. Under a web of pseudonyms and shadow deals, Trumbo continued to write, winning Academy Awards under assumed names, smuggling radical themes past censors, and organizing fellow blacklistees to survive the industry's purge. His most subversive act was not simply surviving, but thriving. He exposed the absurdity of the blacklist by turning its rules inside out, daring Hollywood to acknowledge that even its most celebrated works came from dangerous minds. When he was finally credited for Spartacus and Exodus in 1960, it marked not just his personal redemption, but the slow death of an era's most shameful practices. Trumbo's activism, always secretive but never passive, showed that one artist's resistance could change not just movies, but the very rules of who gets to tell America's stories. 4. Lena Horn. When Lena Horn swept onto the screen in the 1940s, her voice and beauty seemed almost otherworldly. She was the first black woman in Hollywood to sign a long-term contract with a major studio, an achievement that masked a relentless undercurrent of activism few outside her circle would ever see. Horn's rise came at a time when the industry was tightly segregated, and her roles, often limited to glamorous musical numbers, were carefully constructed to allow studios to cut her scenes for Southern audiences. Yet behind the scenes, Horn was anything but compliant. From her earliest days in Hollywood, Horn refused to play domestics or accept demeaning stereotypes. She rejected roles that insulted her dignity and insisted on equal treatment, even as studio heads threatened to end her career. Off-screen, she became a fierce advocate for civil rights. She used her influence to protest the Army's segregation of black soldiers during World War II, refusing to perform for segregated audiences and working with the NAACP to demand change. Horn marched in protests, spoke at rallies, and leveraged her celebrity to bring the struggles of ordinary black Americans into the national spotlight. Her activism made her a target of FBI surveillance, and she was blacklisted during the Red Scare for her associations with left-wing organizations. Hollywood's response was to push her to the margins, yet she endured, performing in nightclubs and on Broadway, never allowing the industry's bigotry to define her. In private, she supported young activists, funded legal defenses for civil rights workers, and refused to be silent, even when silence was the safer path. Lena Horne's legacy is not just her voice, but her courage, a star whose greatest role was played far from the lights of Hollywood, in the trenches of a justice movement. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson's face was familiar to anyone who loved Hollywood gangster films, tough, sharp, and unyielding. But behind the tough guy persona, Robinson was a man shaped by his own immigrant past and a deep commitment to justice. Born in Romania, he arrived in America with nothing, the memory of pogroms and persecution shaping his view of the world. Hollywood gave him stardom, but it also gave him a platform, and Robinson used it, quietly but persistently, to fight against fascism, anti-Semitism, and the creeping darkness he saw rising in Europe and at home. During World War II, Robinson became a fixture in anti-Nazi campaigns. He donated substantial sums to Jewish refugee causes, spoke out at rallies, and starred in films that doubled as propaganda against the Axis powers. He gave so generously and so often to anti-fascist organizations that he eventually attracted the suspicion of the FBI and the House Un-American Activities Committee. Unlike some stars, Robinson wasn't an ideological radical, but he was unafraid to risk his career to defend what he saw as basic human decency. His activism was a double-edged sword. By the late 1940s, he found himself increasingly shut out of leading roles, his loyalty questioned by an industry that had once celebrated him. Robinson never publicly renounced his beliefs, but the blacklist years forced him into B-movies in smaller parts, a quiet punishment for his refusal to stay silent. In his memoirs, Robinson would reflect with both pride and regret on the price he paid for activism, insisting that the fight against tyranny in any form was worth the cost. In the end, the little giant of Hollywood stood tall, not just for the roles he played, but for the battles he fought when the cameras weren't rolling. 6. Humphrey Bogart. Behind the stoic face, trench coat, and iconic fedora, Humphrey Bogart harbored a strong sense of right and wrong that extended far beyond the screen. While his tough guy image was built on roles like Sam Spade and Rick Blaine, off-screen Bogart was quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, a man of principle. His activism wasn't flamboyant, but when the stakes were highest, Bogart put his reputation on the line, standing against what he saw as one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history. The late 1940s were a time of political paranoia, and the House Un-American Activities Committee HUAC was determined to root out supposed communist subversion in the film industry. Many stars stayed silent, protecting their own careers, but Bogart became a founding member of the Committee for the First Amendment, a group of actors, writers, and directors who publicly opposed the blacklist and the intimidation tactics of HUAC. Alongside Lorne Bacall and other major stars, Bogart traveled to Washington, D.C., lending his considerable fame to the defense of civil liberties. He even wrote editorials and spoke at rallies, insisting that the industry's witch hunt threatened the very ideals of American democracy. The blowback was immediate. Studio executives pressured him to recant, whisper campaigns questioned his loyalty, and Bogart's own political naivete became clear as the Red Scare deepened. Under enormous pressure, he eventually distanced himself from the group, but his early activism had already sent a message. Even Hollywood's biggest star was willing to risk it all for the Constitution. Bogart's story isn't one of unwavering radicalism, but of a man who, when faced with injustice, couldn't keep quiet. Though later years saw him return to safer political ground, the mark he left during Hollywood's crisis of conscience remains, a reminder that sometimes even the toughest men are most courageous when they stand up for others. 7. James Cagney. Few could play a streetwise rebel or tough-as-nails gangster like James Cagney, but his real defiance happened behind the scenes. Born into poverty in New York, Cagney carried a lifelong distrust of bullies, whether in back alleys or executive offices. Hollywood in the 1930s was a place where studios ruled with an iron fist, and actors had little power to control their own destinies. Cagney saw this injustice firsthand and made it his mission to fight for the underdog, quietly becoming one of the industry's most effective activists. Cagney's politics were rooted in personal experience. He became involved in the Screen Actors Guild SAG soon after its formation, pushing for better wages, fair working conditions, and health protections for performers at every level. Unlike some who gave only lip service, Cagney rolled up his sleeves, participating in negotiations, funding union activities, and using his leverage as a top box office draw to demand change. He was accused more than once of communist sympathies, charges he vehemently denied, but the rumors never scared him off. Instead, they fueled his commitment to the union, as he believed the only real radical thing in Hollywood was asking for fairness. Off-screen, Cagney supported a range of liberal and labor causes, refusing to cross picket lines and defending colleagues targeted by the blacklist. His activism was never about the spotlight. He saw it as his duty to give back to the community that made his success possible. In his later years, Cagney spoke about the satisfaction of seeing actors gain basic rights and protections, crediting solidarity and persistence rather than political ideology. James Cagney's activism may have been quiet, but it was relentless, a fight not for headlines, but for dignity. 8. Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly brought a revolutionary athleticism and joy to Hollywood musicals, but there was a side to him audiences rarely saw, a man committed to social justice, both in front of the camera and behind closed doors. Kelly's activism didn't grab headlines, but it changed the way Hollywood worked, especially when it came to race and inclusion. Born in working-class Pittsburgh, Kelly never forgot his roots, and his vision of America was one where everyone had a fair shot. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Kelly quietly pushed for integration in an industry that stubbornly clung to segregationist practices. When casting for On the Town, Kelly insisted that black dancers be included as equals, not just background scenery, a radical move for the time. He refused to perform at venues that wouldn't allow integrated audiences, setting an example for peers and executives alike. Behind the scenes, Kelly supported progressive causes, contributed to civil rights organizations, and championed the rights of Hollywood's overlooked artists. Kelly was no grandstanding activist. He preferred action to rhetoric. Colleagues remember his generosity and willingness to use his influence to open doors for others, especially people of color and working-class actors. The risks were real. Studios were wary of anyone seen as too political, and Kelly's choices sometimes meant lost opportunities. But he never wavered. For Kelly, dance was about freedom, and that freedom extended to everyone on stage and in the audience. His activism was as graceful and determined as his choreography, each quiet act a step toward a more inclusive industry. 9. Myrna Loy. Myrna Loy epitomized elegance on screen, often cast as the witty, urbane wife in films like The Thin Man. But away from the camera, Loy's life was defined by a deep commitment to humanitarian causes, making her one of Hollywood's most quietly effective political activists. Growing up in Montana, Loy experienced firsthand the consequences of prejudice and isolation. When she made it to Hollywood, she brought with her a fierce sense of justice and empathy for the marginalized. During World War II, while the U.S. government sent Japanese Americans to internment camps, Loy became one of the few stars to publicly oppose the policy. She wrote letters, spoke out against the injustice, and worked with civil rights organizations to advocate for fair treatment. She also supported the NAACP and lent her name to fundraising campaigns for racial equality. This work wasn't always popular. Loy's activism put her at odds with studio bosses and earned her criticism in a deeply divided nation. But Loy's sense of purpose was unshakable. She saw her stardom as a platform for change, quietly donating to refugee efforts and volunteering for relief programs. Her activism didn't bring her headlines or accolades, but it made a real difference for those she sought to help. Loy's example reminds us that activism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady, persistent work done in the background that truly shapes history. For Myrna Loy, true stardom meant using her influence for good, regardless of the personal cost. Bert Lancaster. Bert Lancaster's screen presence was explosive, physically commanding, intense, impossible to ignore. But behind the smoldering looks and action roles, Lancaster harbored a political conscience that grew bolder with every year. Raised in a poor New York neighborhood, he knew what it meant to struggle, and as his fame skyrocketed, he turned his attention to the struggles of others. By the 1950s, Lancaster had become one of Hollywood's most outspoken progressive voices. Lancaster was a consistent supporter of civil rights, long before it was a popular cause in the industry. He donated to the NAACP, spoke at rallies, and participated in the 1963 March on Washington, walking alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders. His activism extended to labor rights, nuclear disarmament, and opposition to the Vietnam War. He used his clout to challenge the blacklist and employ blacklisted artists whenever possible. Despite backlash from some studios and colleagues, Lancaster refused to temper his beliefs. He was never content with symbolic gestures. Lancaster preferred direct involvement, writing letters, organizing support, and taking to the streets when necessary. His activism sometimes cost him roles and friendships, but he never apologized. For Lancaster, the fight for justice was inseparable from the fight for truth in art. As he once said, "The world is run by those who show up." Bert Lancaster showed up again and again, making his legacy as much about the battles he fought as the films he made. 11. Harry Belafonte. While Harry Belafonte's reign as king of Calypso is often linked with the late 1950s and beyond, his activism roots were firmly planted during Hollywood's golden age. Belafonte's breakthrough in music and film gave him a rare voice in an era when black performers were often boxed in by rigid stereotypes and systemic racism. Behind the smooth vocals and dazzling stage presence, Belafonte was forging alliances that would fuel the civil rights movement for decades. Born to working-class Jamaican immigrants, Belafonte saw activism not as a sideline, but as a responsibility. Even at the height of his early fame, he used his rising influence to challenge segregation, refusing to perform at segregated venues, speaking out against racial injustice, and channeling money from his concerts into bail funds and legal support for activists. Hollywood, with its rigid racial codes and cautious studio heads, often recoiled from such direct challenges. But Belafonte's charisma and popularity made him difficult to silence. His friendship with Martin Luther King Jr. would become legendary, but even before the 1960s, Belafonte was quietly using his clout to support labor strikes, anti-colonial campaigns, and progressive causes across the globe. The risk was real. Government agencies surveilled him, studios grew wary, and some in the industry quietly blackballed him for his outspokenness. Yet Belafonte never shrank from confrontation, seeing each performance and public appearance as an opportunity to advance justice. His activism during the Golden Age helped lay the groundwork for later, more visible battles, reminding Hollywood that true stardom comes with the obligation to fight for those with no voice. In Belafonte's world, artistry and activism were inseparable. His songs and his politics flowed from the same deep conviction that dignity could never be negotiated or delayed. 12th, Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda's filmography reads like a chronicle of America's conscience, always the upright man, the principled outsider, the reluctant hero called to justice. But what many fans never realized was that Fonda's off-screen life mirrored these characters almost perfectly. Beneath the reserved exterior and gentle Midwestern manner was a deeply political mind, quietly working for causes that often put him at odds with the Hollywood establishment. Fonda grew up during the Great Depression, and the experience of hardship and inequality left a mark that never faded. He supported Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and backed liberal candidates when it was considered risky for an A-list star. During the Spanish Civil War, he publicly opposed fascism, and in World War II, he championed the fight against Nazism and supported war bonds and refugee relief. After the war, Fonda continued his advocacy, pushing for labor rights and fair treatment for all Americans. He was a vocal supporter of civil liberties and a critic of the Hollywood blacklist, even as many around him cowered before the threat of HUAC. When others distanced themselves from those under suspicion, Fonda quietly offered support and spoke out for the right to dissent. His activism wasn't flashy. It was steady and consistent, a thread woven through every phase of his career. Despite facing pressure from studios and whispers of being too political, Fonda never compromised his values. To him, the real test of character came not on the screen, but in the choices made away from the spotlight. For Henry Fonda, acting was a profession, but activism was a duty, a legacy that would inspire both his children and generations of Americans who saw him as the living embodiment of integrity. 13th, Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball is remembered as the queen of TV comedy, her red hair and wide-eyed antics forever part of pop culture history. But behind the laughter, there was a chapter in Ball's life that revealed her connection to political activism, one that nearly derailed her career at its peak. In the late 1930s, at her grandfather's insistence, Ball registered as a member of the Communist Party. She later insisted she never attended meetings, but in Cold War America, such a detail was enough to invite scrutiny. When HUAC and the FBI began their deep dive into Hollywood's political loyalties, Ball's name surfaced on the list of suspected subversives. For a moment, her career and the fate of I Love Lucy hung in the balance. But instead of fading quietly, Ball was defiant. She appeared before investigators, explained her family's history, and even cracked jokes about the ordeal, using her comedic gifts to diffuse suspicion. The press and much of the public rallied to her defense. But Ball's politics weren't just a Cold War anomaly. Throughout her career, she supported civil rights, hired black performers and writers at Desilu Productions, and stood up for women's equality both in business and on screen. She backed Democratic candidates, donated to progressive causes, and quietly advocated for those whose voices were less powerful. In a climate that punished deviation, Ball's resilience and quiet activism made a lasting impact. Her story is a reminder that sometimes activism isn't about marches or headlines, but about living fearlessly, breaking rules, and standing by your principles even when the spotlight threatens to turn harsh. Lucille Ball proved that you could change Hollywood without ever losing your sense of humor. 14. Gregory Peck. Gregory Peck's name is synonymous with integrity, a reputation forged not only by his roles in classics like To Kill a Mockingbird, but by a real-life commitment to justice that spanned decades. Peck wasn't interested in controversy for its own sake. Instead, he believed that public figures had a responsibility to use their influence wisely. In an era of political purges and racial tension, Peck stood tall, often risking his career for the sake of what he believed was right. During the Hollywood blacklist, Peck refused to back down. He opposed the House Un-American Activities Committee, spoke out against censorship, and publicly criticized the studios for capitulating to fear. His decision to hire blacklisted writers and support civil liberties organizations earned him enemies in high places, but Peck never wavered. For him, the defense of free speech and the right to dissent were the foundation of a healthy democracy. Peck's activism went beyond the blacklist. He was a consistent supporter of civil rights, joining rallies, fundraising for the NAACP, and lending his star power to voter registration campaigns. He championed nuclear disarmament and spoke out against the Vietnam War, earning both praise and condemnation from across the political spectrum. Studios sometimes threatened to drop him, but Peck saw such risks as part of his duty as a citizen. Even as he played larger-than-life heroes on the screen, Peck's greatest impact was arguably off it, quietly shaping public debates, mentoring young activists, and demonstrating that courage could be both moral and measured. His legacy endures as a model for celebrity activism that balances principle with purpose, reminding Hollywood and America alike that silence in the face of injustice is never an option. 15. Hedi Lamar. Hedi Lamar's legacy is often boiled down to her stunning beauty and glamorous Hollywood roles, but beneath the surface was a woman whose activism was as audacious as her intellect. Born in Austria to Jewish parents, Lamar fled the growing menace of Nazi Germany, bringing with her not only a gift for acting, but a passion for science and social justice. In the gilded confines of 1940s Hollywood, Lamar quietly became an advocate for refugees and a force for Allied victory. As World War II escalated, Lamar put her mind to work for the war effort. Teaming up with composer George Antheil, she co-invented a frequency-hopping technology intended to help Allied torpedoes evade Nazi detection, a foundational development for modern wireless communication. Lamar donated her patent to the U.S. Navy, hoping to turn the tide against fascism, even as studios preferred to keep her brilliance under wraps. But her activism didn't end at science. Lamar used her wealth and influence to support Jewish refugee organizations, raise money for war bonds, and promote the resettlement of displaced families. She spoke out against anti-Semitism and bigotry in Hollywood, often at risk to her own career. Yet, as the industry grew weary of outspoken women and the Red Scare swept the nation, Lamar found herself increasingly sidelined, her inventions unrecognized, her activism almost erased from the record. It was only decades later that Lamar's contributions were fully acknowledged, her story reclaimed by historians who recognized that true courage sometimes meant fighting quietly behind the scenes. Hedi Lamar's life stands as proof that activism and artistry can be as intertwined as beauty and brains, a legacy far more powerful than any studio contract could offer. 16. Frederick March. Frederick March was celebrated for his versatility, able to slip seamlessly between romantic leads, troubled anti-heroes, and dignified statesmen. But beneath his polished performances was a man guided by deeply held principles who quietly lent his influence to some of the most pressing causes of his time. March was a passionate supporter of civil liberties, using his stature to advocate for free speech and fair treatment for all Americans, even as the political winds in Hollywood shifted against such stances. During the 1930s and 1940s, March worked behind the scenes with organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP, lending his star power to fundraising efforts and awareness campaigns. He supported the fight against Nazism during World War II, participating in anti-fascist events and helping to raise funds for European refugees. As the Red Scare spread through Hollywood, March spoke out against the blacklist, defending colleagues who had been targeted and calling for an end to political persecution in the industry. His activism was not without cost. March faced smear campaigns and whispered accusations of communist sympathies designed to intimidate him into silence. Yet he refused to recant or retreat. On set and in public, he remained a model of integrity, proving that one could be both a consummate professional and a quiet force for change. In a city obsessed with image, March's most enduring legacy may be the quiet, determined way he lived his values, reminding us that real heroism often happens far from the spotlight. In a city obsessed with image, March's most enduring legacy may be the quiet, determined way he lived his values, reminding us that real heroism often happens far from the spotlight. 17. Olivia de Havilland. Olivia de Havilland is often remembered for her elegance and poise in classic films, but her greatest performance took place not on screen, but in the courtroom and behind closed doors. In an era when studios exercised total control over their stars, de Havilland launched a legal battle that would forever reshape the industry. Her famous lawsuit against Warner Brothers, now known as the de Havilland Law, freed countless actors from crippling restrictive contracts, giving them the power to choose their own roles and shape their own destinies. But de Havilland's activism didn't stop with her own interests. She became a vocal supporter of workers' rights within the industry, speaking out for fair treatment of crew and craftspeople who were often overlooked. She also supported humanitarian efforts during and after World War II, raising money for refugee relief and championing post-war recovery programs. Her commitment to fairness extended to her dealings with the press and her interactions with fans, always insisting that the privileges of stardom came with the responsibility to help those less fortunate. The risk of her activism was real. Studios blacklisted her for years, and some insiders whispered that she was difficult or ungrateful. Yet de Havilland's resolve never faltered. She saw her fight as one not just for herself, but for every artist trapped by the studio system. Her victory became a model for resistance, inspiring later generations to challenge unfair labor practices, both in Hollywood and beyond. Olivia de Havilland proved that true activism can be elegant, strategic, and above all, an effective reminder that sometimes real power lies in saying no. 18. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck's on-screen characters radiated strength and resilience, and off-screen, she was just as formidable a woman who navigated the minefields of Hollywood with independence and shrewd calculation. While Stanwyck was known for keeping her private life fiercely guarded, she was deeply involved in behind-the-scenes activism, supporting causes she cared about in an era when discretion could mean survival. Stanwyck's brand of activism was subtle but significant. She used her financial success to back charitable organizations, supporting children's welfare, education, and healthcare initiatives. During World War II, she became a tireless fundraiser for war bonds, entertaining troops, and volunteering her time to boost morale. Stanwyck also quietly advocated for gender equality in Hollywood, encouraging young actresses to negotiate their contracts and demand fair pay, pushing women to gain the independence she had fought so hard to secure. Though Stanwyck's politics were complicated, she maintained friendships across the ideological spectrum. Her consistent defense of the underdog, her donations to relief efforts, and her encouragement of labor rights reflected a deep belief in individual dignity and self-reliance. She never sought recognition for her activism, preferring to work behind the scenes, but her influence was unmistakable. In a business that thrived on conformity, Stanwyck showed that a determined woman could break the rules, help others, and never lose her edge. 19th, Marsha Hunt. For many, Marsha Hunt was a familiar face in 1940s Hollywood, bright, charming, and endlessly versatile. But after the blacklist, she became something even rarer, a fearless activist who refused to be silenced by intimidation or exclusion. Hunt's activism began at the height of her career, when she joined the Committee for the First Amendment and traveled to Washington to protest HUAC's assault on Hollywood's freedoms. Hunt's convictions ran deep. She campaigned for civil rights, organized food and clothing drives for refugees after World War II, and became a dedicated supporter of the United Nations. Even after her name appeared on the blacklist, costing her film roles and financial security, Hunt doubled down, speaking at schools and community centers about democracy, peace, and the dangers of political repression. While other stars faded into obscurity, Hunt reinvented herself as an advocate, focusing on hunger, homelessness, and equal rights for decades after her Hollywood heyday. Marsha Hunt's journey is a testament to the power of conviction in the face of adversity. She outlasted the blacklist, outworked her detractors, and inspired generations with her relentless optimism and courage. In Hollywood, where silence was often safer, Hunt proved that a determined voice could ring out long after the cameras stopped rolling. Her activism, both public and deeply personal, remains one of the most enduring stories of resistance from the Golden Age. 20. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was more than a Hollywood prodigy. He was a disruptor whose activism often upstaged even his own artistic achievements. Best known for Citizen Kane, Welles's political engagement began long before Hollywood. His 1936 all-black production of Macbeth in Harlem was both a cultural milestone and a pointed stand against racism. Throughout the 1940s, Welles used radio, stage, and screen to champion labor rights, civil liberties, and racial equality. He narrated and produced anti-fascist broadcasts during World War II and publicly denounced segregation, famously giving a radio speech demanding justice for Isaac Woodard, a black veteran brutalized by police, a moment that triggered a federal investigation. Welles aligned with liberal and leftist causes, helping raise money for Spanish Civil War refugees and supporting labor unions at a time when it could torpedo a career. During the early Cold War years, his outspoken nature and friendships with blacklisted artists put him under FBI surveillance and made him a target of right-wing Hollywood power brokers. Welles was forced into a kind of exile, yet continued his advocacy from abroad, speaking out against McCarthyism and colonial oppression while making films that probed social injustice. Despite the personal and professional costs, studios blacklisted him, funding dried up, and collaborators turned wary. Welles never apologized for his activism. He saw art and politics as inseparable, insisting that filmmakers had a responsibility to confront uncomfortable truths. Orson Welles' legacy isn't just cinematic innovation. It's the blueprint for using celebrity as a platform for justice and for paying the price when the world wasn't ready for change. Hollywood's golden age wasn't just built on glamour, it was shaped in the shadows by stars whose courage outlasted their contracts. For every headline and scandal, there were quiet battles waged behind closed doors, risks taken when silence was safer. Their activism left fingerprints on the industry and ripples across generations. As the lights fade and the credits roll, one truth remains. In a world ruled by image, the real legends are those who dared to stand for something greater than fame